I stared at the text message on my phone for the third time, my hands trembling slightly as the words blurred together. Mom, we need to talk about Dad's finances. Meet me at the house tomorrow at 2. The message was from my daughter Sarah, and the tone felt cold, clinical, nothing like the warm voice that used to call me just to chat about her day. The October wind rattled the windows of my small apartment, and I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. 3 months had passed since Robert's funeral, 3 months since I'd moved out of the house we'd shared for 28 years. And still Sarah seemed to think I was some kind of financial burden that needed managing. At 57, I'd thought I was done being treated like a child, but grief had a way of making everyone forget who you really were. I set the phone down on my kitchen counter and watched the steam rise from my coffee mug, the familiar ritual offering little comfort. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Highway 6. When I'd rented this place in August, the landlord had called it cozy, but what he'd really meant was small. Still, it was mine, and after years of Robert making every decision about our home having control over my own space, felt like a small revolution. The next afternoon, I pulled into the driveway of what used to be my house. Sarah's silver SUV was already there, gleaming in the autumn sunshine. The maple tree Robert had planted when Sarah was born had turned brilliant orange, its leaves scattered across the lawn like discarded memories. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering courage before walking up the familiar brick path. "Mom, you're late," Sarah said as she opened the front door. She was dressed in her real estate clothes, navy blazer, crisp white blouse hair pulled back in a perfect bun. At 32, she'd inherited her father's efficiency and his inability to see beyond the numbers on a spreadsheet. "I'm 5 minutes late, honey. Traffic was heavy coming from. We need to get started. I have a showing at 4. She stepped aside to let me in, and the smell of the house hit me immediately. Robert's aftershave still lingering in the hallway, mixed with the faint scent of the vanilla candles I used to burn in the evenings. Everything looked exactly the same, yet felt completely foreign. I followed Sarah into the living room, where she'd arranged papers across the coffee table like evidence at a trial. She gestured for me to sit in what used to be my chair, the burgundy recliner, where I'd read countless books and watched the evening news with Robert. Now it felt like I was visiting someone else's life. "Mom, I've been going through Dad's files and we have a problem." Sarah picked up a manila folder and opened it with the precision of a surgeon. The life insurance payout was smaller than we thought, and there are some debts I didn't know about. "What kind of debts?" I asked, though my stomach was already sinking. Robert had always handled the finances, insisting it was his responsibility as the man of the house. I'd tried to be involved over the years, but he'd waved me away with that patient smile of his, the one that said he knew better. "Credit cards mostly, and there's a loan against his 401k that has to be paid back." Sarah's voice was matter of fact, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Mom, you can't afford to keep living on your own. The apartment rent, utilities, groceries, it's going to eat through your savings in less than 2 years. I felt my face flush with heat. "Sarah, I've been managing just fine. I have my part-time job at the library and 20 hours a week at $12 an hour. Mom, that's not even enough to cover your groceries." She pulled out a legal pad, covered with her neat handwriting. "I've run the numbers. You need to move in with Tom and me. We have the guest room and it makes financial sense." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I thought about Sarah's guest room with its beige walls and single twin bed tucked away in the back corner of her house like an afterthought. I thought about the careful way she organized her kitchen with labels on every shelf and a schedule for every meal. I thought about how she'd want to manage my medication, my appointments, my entire life, the way she was trying to manage my finances right now. "I appreciate the offer, sweetheart, but I'm not ready for that." I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. "I need my independence right now. I need time to figure out who I am without your father." Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "Mum, this isn't about what you want. This is about being practical. You can't afford to be sentimental about independence when you're looking at potential poverty. Potential poverty. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. Sarah, I'm 57 years old. I'm not some helpless elderly woman who needs to be managed. You're acting like one, though. The comment hit like a slap, and I saw Sarah immediately regret it. I'm sorry that came out wrong, but Mom, you've never lived alone. You went from your parents' house to college to marrying Dad. You don't understand how expensive everything is. I stood up from the chair, my hands clenched at my sides. I understand more than you think I do. I've been buying groceries and paying bills and keeping house for 30 years. Just because your father signed the checks doesn't mean I didn't know where the money went. Then you know we don't have choices here. Sarah's voice was rising now, the composed real estate agent mask slipping to reveal the worried daughter underneath. The mortgage on this house isn't paid off. Dad took out a second mortgage 3 years ago to pay for the kitchen renovation, and there's still $40,000 owed. We have to sell it, and even then, after paying off the debts and the realtor fees, you're looking at maybe $30,000 in equity. The number hit me like cold water. $30,000 from a lifetime of building a home together. I sank back into the chair, feeling suddenly dizzy. I know it's not what we hoped for. Sarah continued, her voice gentler now. But if you move in with us, you can bank that money and use your Social Security to help with household expenses. It's the only way this works financially. I stared at the papers scattered across the coffee table, seeing numbers and dollar signs instead of the life Robert and I had built together. What about the pension your father worked for the city for 35 years? Mum, the pension died with Dad. You get a small survivor benefit, about $400 a month, but that's it. Sarah sat down on the edge of the couch, leaning forward, with her elbows on her knees. I've spent weeks going through all of this. I've talked to financial advisors, I've run every scenario I can think of. Moving in with us is the only option that doesn't end with you running out of money. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine it giving up my little apartment with its view of the parking lot and the oak tree where squirrels played in the mornings. Moving into Sarah's perfectly organized house where everything had its place and disruption wasn't welcome. Becoming the kind of mother-in-law who lived in the guest room and tried to stay out of the way. What does Tom think about this? I asked, opening my eyes to meet Sarah's gaze. He's fine with it. He likes you, Mom, and honestly, with his work schedule and the kids' activities, having you there to help with dinner and transportation would be a blessing. Sarah's voice had taken on that persuasive tone she used with difficult clients. Emma and Jake adore you. They'd love having Grandma live with them. The mention of my grandchildren tugged at something deep in my chest. 8-year-old Emma with her gap-toothed grin and endless questions about everything. 10-year-old Jake, who still let me read to him sometimes, though he pretended he was too old for it. I did love spending time with them, but there was a difference between being the visiting grandmother who brought cookies and surprises, and being the live-in grandmother who was always there, always underfoot. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Mom time is exactly what we don't have. I need to list this house by the end of the month if we want to close before the holidays. And your lease is up in December, right? It's perfect timing. Perfect timing. As if my entire life could be reduced to a real estate transaction schedule. I stood up again, this time with more resolve. Sarah, I understand that you're trying to help and I love you for it. But this is my decision to make and I'm not making it today. Mom, no. The word came out with more force than I'd used in years. I'm not arguing with you about this. I'm not rejecting your help. But I am not going to be pressured into a decision that will affect the rest of my life because it fits your timeline. Sarah's mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to argue with me about bedtime testing boundaries and pushing limits. What are you going to do then? Live in denial until the money runs out? I'm going to explore my options. Maybe there are solutions we haven't thought of yet. I picked up my purse from the side table, my hands steadier now that I'd found my voice. Your father may have made all the financial decisions, but that doesn't mean I can't learn to make them myself. Mom, you can't just wing it with finances. This isn't like deciding what to cook for dinner. Sarah was following me toward the front door, now her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. You need professional help, you need a plan, I need my daughter to trust that I'm not completely incompetent. I turned to face her in the foyer where Robert's jacket still hung on the coat rack. Sarah, honey, I know you mean well, but you can't manage my life for me no matter how good your intentions are. I'm not trying to manage your life. I'm trying to save it. There were tears in Sarah's eyes now, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she looked genuinely vulnerable. Mum, I can't lose you too. I can't watch you struggle and fail because you're too proud to accept help. The words hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. I reached out and touched her face the way I used to when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. You're not going to lose me, sweetheart, but you might lose me if you don't let me find my own way through this. I kissed her forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. Give me 2 weeks, 2 weeks to see what's possible, and then we'll talk again. 2 weeks isn't enough time It's enough time for me to do some research and make some calls. Trust me to handle this, Sarah, please. She nodded reluctantly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Okay, 2 weeks, but Mum promised me you'll be realistic about this. Don't let pride get in the way of common sense. I promise, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was promising. As I walked back to my car, I felt the weight of Robert's absence more acutely than I had since the funeral. He would have known what to do, would have had a plan and a backup plan, and probably a spreadsheet to track it all. But Robert was gone, and for the first time in my adult life, I was completely on my own. The drive back to my apartment gave me time to think, to let the conversation with Sarah settle into something I could examine more clearly. She wasn't wrong about the money, $30,000, and a small social security check wouldn't stretch very far, but she also wasn't right about my options being limited to moving in with her family. There had to be other possibilities, other ways to make the numbers work that didn't require me to give up the small measure of independence I'd fought so hard to claim. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad of my own, trying to make sense of my financial situation. The apartment rent was $650 a month, utilities averaged about 120 groceries, maybe 200 if I was careful. Car payment, insurance, phone bill, the numbers added up quickly, just as Sarah had said they would. But there were also numbers Sarah hadn't considered. My part-time salary from the library wasn't much, but it was steady, and Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, had mentioned the possibility of additional hours during the holiday season. More importantly, there were aspects of my life that couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. The Tuesday book club that met in the community room of my apartment complex, where I'd found a group of women my age who understood the particular challenges of starting over in midlife. The walking group that met every Saturday morning at the park, led by a retired nurse named Grace, who had become something like a surrogate sister to me. The quiet satisfaction of making my own decisions about what to eat, when to sleep, which television programs to watch in the evening. I thought about my conversation with Robert's sister Janet the week after the funeral. She'd told me that Robert had always worried about me being too dependent, as if that were some kind of character flaw rather than a natural result of the life we'd built together. He used to say you'd never survive on your own, Janet had mentioned, casually, probably thinking she was offering comfort. But the comment had stung, partly because I'd wondered the same thing myself. Now, 3 months later, I was surviving. More than surviving, actually. I was learning things about myself that I'd never had the chance to discover while Robert was alive. I liked having coffee for dinner, sometimes reading until 2 in the morning, leaving dishes in the sink overnight if I felt like it. Small rebellions perhaps, but they felt significant to someone who had spent 3 decades considering another person's preferences before her own. The next morning I called the library and asked Mrs. Patterson if we could meet for coffee. She suggested the little cafe down the street from the branch where I worked, a place called The Daily Grind, that served surprisingly good scones and had tables by the window where you could watch the morning commuters rush past with their travel mugs and purposeful expressions. "I'm glad you called," Mrs. Patterson said as we settled into a corner table with our coffee. She was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair that she wore in a stylish bob, and the kind of presence that made patrons automatically lower their voices when she walked through the stacks. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." "Oh." I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug, enjoying the warmth against my palms. October mornings had turned crisp, requiring sweaters, and the kind of wool socks I'd always associated with getting older. "We're expanding our community outreach programs, and I think you'd be perfect to help coordinate them." Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "It would mean more hours, probably 30 a week, and a small bump in pay. But more importantly, it would involve working with senior centres, retirement communities, homebound patrons, people who need library services but can't always come to us." I felt something flutter in my chest, a sensation I recognised as hope. "What would that involve exactly?" "Home visits for book delivery, setting up reading programs at senior centres, maybe organising some technology classes for older adults who want to learn about computers and smartphones." She smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she'd been thinking about this for a while. "You have a way with people, Margaret, and you understand this demographic in a way that some of our younger staff members don't." The irony wasn't lost on me being offered a job specifically because of my age and life experience rather than despite them. "When would this start?" "January, ideally. It would give you time to finish out your current responsibilities and let me work through the budget details with the board." Mrs. Patterson reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. "I know this has been a difficult year for you, but I also know you're stronger than you think you are." I thought about Sarah's spreadsheets and financial projections about the guest room with its beige walls and single bed. "Mrs. Patterson, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Have you ever had to start over later in life? I mean," she was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "I got divorced when I was 53, after 28 years of marriage. Everyone assumed I'd fall apart, that I couldn't manage on my own." She looked up at me with a wry smile. "It turned out that managing on my own was the easy part. The hard part was convincing everyone else that I could do it." "How did you convince them?" "I stopped trying to convince them and started proving it to myself instead." She leaned back in her chair, studying my face. "Margaret is someone pressuring you to make changes you're not ready for." I told her about the conversation with Sarah, about the financial constraints and the offer to move in with her family. Mrs. Patterson listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her expression growing more thoughtful as I spoke. "Your daughter loves you," she said when I finished. "But love doesn't always translate into wisdom. Sometimes the people who care about us most are the ones who have the hardest time seeing us clearly." I don't want to be stubborn or foolish about this. Maybe she's right. Maybe I am being unrealistic. Or maybe you're being realistic about things that can't be measured on a spreadsheet. Mrs. Patterson finished her coffee and glanced at her watch. "Think about the job offer, Margaret, and think about what you want your life to look like, not just what's financially feasible. Sometimes the two are closer together than we think." Walking back to my car, I felt the stirring of something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of possibility. The job offer wouldn't solve all my financial problems, but it would certainly help. More importantly, it would give me a sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning that had nothing to do with being someone's mother or grandmother or widow. It would be mine. That afternoon, I decided to visit one of the senior centres Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, the Riverside Community Centre, about 10 minutes from my apartment. I told myself I was just curious about the outreach programme, but really I wanted to see what my life might look like if I took the job, if I stayed independent, if I chose a different path than the one Sarah had mapped out for me. The centre was housed in a converted elementary school with wide hallways and large windows that filled the spaces with natural light. The main activity room buzzed with conversation as a group of women worked on what appeared to be a community quilt, their hands moving with practiced efficiency as they shared stories and laughter. "Can I help you?" asked a woman with short grey hair and paint-stained fingers. She looked to be about my age, with the kind of smile that suggested she genuinely enjoyed meeting new people. I'm Margaret Walsh. I work at the public library and we're thinking about expanding our services here. I wanted to see what you were all about. I'm Carol Jensen, the volunteer coordinator, and you picked a perfect day to visit. She gestured toward the quilting group. These ladies are working on a memorial quilt for veterans. It'll be displayed at the courthouse next month for Veterans Day. She gave me a tour of the facility, showing me the computer lab, where seniors learn to video chat with distant grandchildren, the exercise room where a silver-haired instructor led a gentle yoga class, the kitchen where volunteers prepared meals for homebound community members. What struck me most was the energy of the place, not the resigned contentment I'd expected from a senior centre, but a genuine vitality, a sense of people engaged in meaningful work. We could definitely use more programming, Carol said as we finished the tour. A lot of our members love to read, but getting to the library isn't always easy. Some have mobility issues, others don't drive anymore. A book delivery service would be wonderful. What about technology classes? Do people express interest in that? All the time. We have a few computers, but most of our members are intimidated by them. They want to email their children, look at photos on Facebook, maybe shop online, but they don't know where to start. Carol opened the door to a small office lined with filing cabinets and community resource brochures. Are you thinking about volunteering, or is this part of your job at the library? Both maybe. I'm considering a career change. The words came out before I'd fully formed the thought, but saying them out loud felt right somehow. Well, if you decide to make a change, we'd love to have you here in whatever capacity works for you. Carol handed me her business card and a packet of information about the centre's programs. We're always looking for people who understand that getting older doesn't mean getting invisible. Driving home. I thought about that phrase, getting invisible. It captured something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. Since Robert's death, since moving out of the house where I'd raised my children and hosted holiday dinners and celebrated anniversaries, I'd felt like I was disappearing, somehow becoming less significant in the world. Sarah's well-meaning offer to let me live in her guest room felt like the final step in that disappearance. The transformation from independent woman to dependent relative. But the senior centre had shown me something different, a community of people who were claiming their space in the world, contributing their skills, and experience refusing to fade into the background of someone else's life. It wasn't about denying the realities of aging or pretending that financial concerns didn't matter. It was about recognizing that those concerns didn't define the entirety of what was possible. That evening, I made a list of phone calls I needed to make. First, a financial advisor who could give me a clearer picture of my situation and help me explore options Sarah might not have considered. Second, an appointment with the Social Security Office to understand exactly what benefits I was entitled to and when they would begin. Third, a conversation with Mrs. Patterson about the details of the job offer and what additional training might be required. But before I made any of those calls, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. "Hi, Mom." Sarah's voice was cautious, probably wondering if I was calling to argue about our conversation the day before. "Hi, sweetheart. I wanted to let you know that I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right about some things. I do need to be more realistic about my finances, and I do need to plan more carefully for the future." "Oh?" She sounded surprised, maybe a little relieved. "I'm glad you're being open to, but I also want you to know that I've been offered a better position at the library, one that would give me more hours and better pay. And I've been thinking about other ways to make the numbers work that don't involve moving in with your family." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mom, what kind of position and how much better pay are we talking about?" I told her about the conversation with Mrs. Patterson, about the community outreach program, and the possibility of working with senior centres. I could hear the skepticism in her voice as she asked questions about benefits and job security, and whether the position was guaranteed to last. "It sounds interesting, Mom, but it's still not enough. Even if you're making $15 an hour for 30 hours a week, that's only about $24,000 a year before taxes. With your other expenses—" "Sarah, stop. I said it gently but firmly. I'm not calling to ask for your approval of my choices. I'm calling to let you know that I'm taking responsibility for my future, but I'm doing it my way. What does that mean exactly, A? It means I'm going to talk to a financial advisor and see what options I haven't considered yet. It means I'm going to make sure I understand all my benefits and resources. And it means I'm going to make an informed decision about how I want to live based on all the factors that matter to me, not just the ones that show up on a spreadsheet. And if the financial advisor tells you the same thing I did, that you can't afford to live independently, I looked around my small apartment at the books stacked on the coffee table, the photographs of my grandchildren on the kitchen counter, the soft throw blanket I'd bought just because I liked the colour. Then I'll deal with that when it happens, but I'm not going to assume the worst-case scenario is the only scenario. Mom, Sarah honey, I love you, and I appreciate that you're worried about me, but you have to let me figure this out for myself. You have to trust that I can learn to make good decisions, even if they're not the decisions you would make. Another long pause. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was softer, less certain. I just don't want you to get hurt, financially or otherwise. I know, and I don't want to get hurt either, but I also don't want to live my life in fear of what might happen. I spent 30 years letting your father make the important decisions because it seemed easier because I trusted him to know better. And maybe he did know better in a lot of ways, but he's gone now and I have to learn to trust myself. Okay, Sarah said finally. Okay, 2 weeks like you said, but Mom promised me you'll really talk to a professional. Not just Mrs. Patterson, who's obviously going to be biased toward offering you the job, but someone who can give you objective advice about your financial situation. I promise, and Sarah, thank you for caring enough to have these difficult conversations with me. I know it's not easy for you either. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, feeling something shift inside me. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I was moving forward rather than just reacting to circumstances beyond my control. It was a small feeling, tentative and fragile, but it was unmistakably mine. The next morning, I called the financial advisor Mrs. Patterson had recommended a woman named Jennifer Liu, who specialized in helping widows navigate their new financial reality. She could see me the following Tuesday, which gave me the weekend to gather the documents I would need: bank statements, insurance papers, social security estimates, and the folder of information Sarah had compiled about Robert's debts and assets. Saturday morning, I joined the walking group at Riverside Park for the first time since Robert's funeral. The group met at 8 o'clock near the duck pond, a collection of women ranging in age from their early 50s to their late 70s. All wearing comfortable shoes and determined expressions. Grace, the retired nurse who organised the walks, welcomed me back with a hug that lasted longer than necessary, the kind of hug that acknowledged shared loss without requiring explanation. "How are you really doing?" asked a woman named Linda, who had introduced herself as a recently divorced mother of 3. She fell into step beside me as we began our circuit around the pond, where early morning joggers were already claiming the path, and ducks were demanding breakfast from anyone who looked promising. "I'm figuring it out," I said, and for the first time that felt like an honest answer rather than a deflection. "Good for you. The figuring out part is harder than people think." Linda adjusted her baseball cap against the morning sun. "Everyone wants to tell you what you should do, how you should feel, how long you should take to get over things. But nobody can walk your path for you." As we completed our first lap around the pond, Grace fell back to join our conversation. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you planning to stay in the area? I know some people relocate after a major loss to be closer to family or to start fresh somewhere new." "I'm planning to stay," I said, surprised by how certain I sounded. "This is home. My grandchildren are here. My job is here. My life is here. I'm not ready to start over somewhere completely new." "That's wise," said another walker, a woman named Betty, who had been quiet until now. "I moved to Florida after my husband died, thinking a change of scenery would help. Spent 2 miserable years in a retirement community where I didn't know a soul and everything felt artificial. Finally moved back here and realized that what I needed wasn't a new place, it was a new way of being in the place I already belonged. The conversation continued as we walked, ranging from practical matters like finding good mechanics and reliable handymen to more philosophical questions about purpose and independence and what it meant to build a life rather than just survive one. By the time we completed our 3-mile circuit, I felt connected to something larger than my own fears and uncertainties. Same time next week? Grace asked as we stretched near the parking area. Absolutely, I said, and meant it. The appointment with Jennifer Liu took place in a small office above a coffee shop in the downtown area, a space that felt more like a living room than a business establishment. Jennifer was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of calm presence that suggested she'd had many difficult conversations about money and loss and uncertain futures. "Tell me about your concerns," she said after we'd reviewed my financial documents. "What keeps you awake at night?" I told her about Sarah's projections about the pressure to move in with her family, about my desire to maintain my independence, but my fear that I was being unrealistic about what I could afford. Jennifer listened without taking notes, asking occasional questions, but mostly letting me talk through my worries out loud. "Okay," she said when I finished. "Let's look at what you're actually working with and then we'll talk about strategies." She spread my documents across her desk and walked me through the numbers explaining concepts like asset allocation and withdrawal rates and inflation protection that Robert had handled without ever bothering to educate me about. What became clear was that my situation was neither as dire as Sarah had suggested nor as simple as I'd hoped. "The good news is that you have more resources than you realize," Jennifer said, pointing to a summary sheet she'd prepared. "Your Social Security benefit will be higher than your daughter calculated because she didn't account for the fact that you can claim based on your husband's earnings record rather than your own. And the survivor benefits from his pension, while not huge, will provide a small buffer." "What about the debt? Sarah said there were credit cards and a loan against his 401k. Those are legitimate concerns and they'll need to be addressed as part of settling the estate, but they're not insurmountable, especially if you sell the house." Jennifer pulled out a calculator and started running scenarios. "If you can clear $30,000 from the house sale after paying off debts, and if you invest that money conservatively while you're still working, you'll have a foundation to build on. And the job at the library, is that enough to make a difference? It's more than enough to make a difference. If you can work even part-time for the next 8 years until you reach full retirement age, you'll be in a much stronger position." Jennifer leaned back in her chair, studying the numbers. "Margaret, I'm not going to tell you this will be easy or that you'll have the same lifestyle you had when your husband was alive, but I am going to tell you that living independently is absolutely achievable if you're willing to be intentional about your choices." What does being intentional mean exactly? It means creating a budget that reflects your actual priorities rather than your old habits. It means distinguishing between what you need and what you're used to having. It means building an emergency fund even if it's small and having a plan for how you'll handle unexpected expenses. Jennifer handed me a folder with worksheets and planning guides. It also means having realistic conversations with your family about what you can and cannot afford to contribute to things like holiday gifts and grandchildren's activities. The last point hit me unexpectedly. I'd always been the grandmother who remembered every birthday with a generous gift, who took the grandchildren shopping for school clothes, who contributed to their college funds. The idea of having to scale back those gestures felt like another kind of loss. "I can see that troubles you," Jennifer said gently, "but think about it this way. What do your grandchildren really need from you? Is it the expensive gifts, or is it your presence and attention and love?" I thought about Emma and Jake, about the times they seemed happiest when I visited. It wasn't when I brought them new toys or took them to expensive restaurants. It was when I read to them, when I taught Emma to braid friendship bracelets, when I helped Jake with his science project, when I listened to their stories about school and friends and the small dramas of childhood. Those moments didn't cost anything except time and attention. You're right, I said. I think I've been confusing generosity with love. It's an easy mistake to make, especially when you're dealing with guilt about not being able to provide the same level of financial support you used to. Jennifer smiled. But children are remarkably good at understanding when circumstances change, as long as the adults in their lives are honest about what's happening. Walking back to my car after the appointment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: confidence. Not the false bravado of pretending everything was fine, but the real confidence that came from understanding my situation clearly and having a plan to address it. Jennifer had given me homework: create a realistic budget, research investment options for the money from the house sale, and have a conversation with Sarah about my decision to stay independent. The conversation with Sarah was harder than I'd anticipated. I called her that evening and asked if she could come to my apartment the next day, suggesting that it was time for her to see how I was actually living, rather than imagining the worst-case scenario. She arrived on Thursday afternoon carrying a bouquet of flowers and wearing the slightly apprehensive expression of someone who wasn't sure what to expect. I gave her the full tour of my small space, pointing out the efficiency of the kitchen, the comfort of the reading chair by the window, the view of the oak tree where squirrels provided daily entertainment. "It's smaller than I remembered," she said, settling onto my couch with a cup of tea. "It's exactly the right size for one person who doesn't need a lot of space," I replied. "Sarah, I've spent the last week talking to professionals and doing research just like I promised, and I've made my decision." I told her about the meeting with Jennifer Liu, about the job opportunity at the library, about the walking group and the senior centre, and the community of people who were proving that starting over didn't have to mean giving up. I showed her the budget worksheet Jennifer had helped me create, the realistic projections that demonstrated how I could make independence work. "Mom, this assumes everything goes perfectly. What if you get sick? What if the library cuts your hours? What if the car breaks down or you need major dental work?" Sarah was studying the budget with the same intensity she brought to her real estate contracts. "There's no cushion here for emergencies." "You're right, there's not much cushion, but there's also not much risk." I sat down beside her on the couch, close enough to see the worry lines around her eyes. "Sarah, honey, what are you really afraid of?" "I'm afraid you'll run out of money and be too proud to ask for help until it's too late. I'm afraid you'll get sick and there won't be anyone to take care of you. I'm afraid you'll be lonely and isolated and convince yourself you're fine when you're really struggling." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for weeks. "Those are all legitimate fears," I said. "And they're fears I have too, but they're also fears that exist whether I live independently or move in with your family. What if I get sick while I'm living with you? What if you and Tom decide you need the space for something else? What if living in your house makes me feel more like a burden than living on my own?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, turning her teacup in her hands. "I hadn't thought about it that way. I know you want to protect me, sweetheart, but protection and control aren't the same thing." I reached over and covered her hand with mine. "The best protection you can give me is the knowledge that you believe I'm capable of making good decisions for myself. But what if you make bad decisions? What if you're wrong about this? Then I'll deal with the consequences and adjust my plan accordingly. That's what adults do. We make the best decisions we can with the information we have, and we adapt when circumstances change." I smiled at her, the same reassuring smile I'd used when she was afraid to start kindergarten, afraid to try out for the school play, afraid to go away to college. "Sarah, you raised two beautiful children while building a career and maintaining a marriage. You buy and sell houses worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. You make important decisions every day. Where do you think you learned to do those things?" "From Dad, mostly." "From both of us. Your father taught you about numbers and planning and thinking ahead, but I taught you about resilience and adaptation and trusting your instincts when the numbers don't tell the whole story." I squeezed her hand gently. "Now, I need you to trust that I learned something from watching you grow into such a capable, confident woman." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. When did you get so wise? I've always been this wise. I just used to let other people make the decisions, so I never had to prove it. I handed her the tissue box from the coffee table. Sarah, I need you to know that this isn't about rejecting your help or your love. It's about accepting responsibility for my own life. And I need you to support that choice, even if it's not the choice you would make. Okay, she said, wiping her eyes. Okay, but Mum promised me you'll ask for help if you need it. Not just from me, but from anyone, your friends, Mrs. Patterson, the church, whoever. Promise me you won't suffer in silence because you're trying to prove a point. I promise, and Sarah, promise me you'll let me help you sometimes too. I know you think you have to manage everything on your own, but I have skills and experience and time to offer. Let me be useful to your family in ways that don't involve being a financial burden. Like what? Like picking up the kids from school sometimes so you don't have to leave work early. Like helping with dinner when you have evening showings. Like being an extra pair of hands during the holidays instead of another mouth to feed. I grinned at her. Like teaching Emma to knit and helping Jake with his book reports and being the kind of grandmother who's available but not underfoot. The conversation continued for another hour, ranging over practical matters like emergency contacts and holiday plans to more emotional territory about grief and change and what it meant to be family when the traditional structures shifted. By the time Sarah left, we had reached a new understanding, not agreement exactly, but a recognition that we could love and support each other without requiring identical visions of how that support should look. The following Monday, I accepted Mrs. Patterson's job offer with a start date of January the 2nd. The additional hours and responsibilities would challenge me in ways I hadn't been challenged in years, but the prospect felt energizing rather than overwhelming. I spent the remainder of October and November preparing for the transition, taking computer classes at the Senior Centre, attending library conferences about outreach programming, and building relationships with the staff at various community organisations where I would be working. The house sold in early December exactly as Sarah had predicted it would. After paying off the debts and covering the real estate fees, I netted $28,000, close enough to Jennifer Liu's projections to validate her financial planning, but also small enough to underscore how carefully I would need to manage my resources going forward. Rather than feeling discouraged by the modest sum, I felt liberated. $28,000 represented freedom from debt and the foundation for whatever came next. Christmas was different that year, but not diminished. Instead of hosting the elaborate dinner I'd prepared for decades, I contributed side dishes to the meal Sarah prepared at her house. Instead of expensive gifts, I gave each family member something: handmade photo albums for the adults, knitted scarves for the children, homemade cookies in decorated tins for everyone. The gifts cost less, but required more of me, and the response was more enthusiastic than any expensive present I'd ever purchased. "Grandma, did you really make this?" Emma asked, running her fingers over the soft purple scarf I'd knitted for her. "Can you teach me how to do it?" "Of course I can teach you," I said, realizing that this was exactly the kind of usefulness I'd talked about with Sarah. "We can start with a simple pattern and work our way up to something more complicated." Jake, not to be outdone by his sister's enthusiasm, asked if I could help him learn to cook some of the dishes I'd brought to dinner. "Mum's always too busy to teach me, but you have time, right, Grandma? I have all the time in the world for projects like that," I assured him, meaning every word. As I drove home to my small apartment that evening, my car filled with leftover food, and my heart filled with satisfaction, I thought about the conversation that had started this entire journey. Sarah's spreadsheets and financial projections had been accurate in their way, but they hadn't accounted for all the variables that mattered. They hadn't measured the value of waking up in my own space, of making my own choices about how to spend my time, of being useful to my family without being dependent on them. They hadn't calculated the worth of friendship and community and the particular kind of confidence that came from successfully navigating challenges on my own terms. January brought the start of my new position at the library, and with it a routine that felt both purposeful and sustainable. 3 days a week, I made home visits to deliver books and help homebound patrons access digital resources. 2 days a week, I worked at various senior centres leading book discussions and teaching basic computer skills. The work was more rewarding than I'd expected, introducing me to people who had fascinating stories to tell and wisdom to share, reminding me that aging was not a process of diminishment but of accumulation, accumulating experience, perspective, resilience, and understanding. One February afternoon, I was helping a 90-year-old woman named Rose set up email on her tablet so she could communicate with her great-grandchildren in California. Rose lived in a senior living community but was sharp as a tack with opinions about everything from current politics to the best way to make pie crust. She'd been resistant to technology for years, but the pandemic had convinced her that staying connected required embracing tools she'd previously dismissed. "I don't understand why everything has to be so complicated," she said, as I showed her how to navigate between her inbox and her contacts list. "In my day, if you wanted to talk to someone, you picked up the phone. The nice thing about email is that you can send pictures and have conversations that don't depend on both people being available at the same time." I explained helping her compose her first message to her great-grandson. "And once you get the hang of it, it's actually pretty simple." That's what everyone says. It's simple once you get the hang of it. But getting the hang of it is the hard part. Rose's fingers moved carefully across the tablet screen, selecting letters with the deliberate precision of someone who'd learned to type on a manual typewriter decades earlier. "How did you learn all this computer stuff, Margaret? You seem so comfortable with it." "I learned because I had to," I said honestly. "After my husband died, I realized there were a lot of things I'd never learned to do because I'd always had someone else to do them for me. Technology was one of those things. And now I'm not an expert, but I'm competent. I can do what I need to do, and I can learn new things when I need to learn them." I watched Rose successfully send her first email and saw the look of triumph that crossed her face. The secret is not being afraid to make mistakes. Computers are more forgiving than people sometimes. Rose laughed a sound like silver bells. "That's the truth. My great-grandson will probably get a dozen nonsense messages before I figure out how to do this properly, but he'll be so excited to hear from me that he won't care." Driving home that evening, I thought about the conversation with Rose and how it reflected my own experience over the past year. I'd made plenty of mistakes as I learned to manage my finances, navigate my new job responsibilities, and build a life that was entirely my own design. But the mistakes hadn't been disasters, they'd been learning opportunities, chances to adjust my approach and try again with better information. The walking group had become a cornerstone of my week, providing not just physical exercise, but emotional support and practical wisdom from women who were facing similar challenges. Grace had become a particularly close friend, someone I could call when I needed advice about everything from negotiating with repair technicians to dealing with difficult family dynamics. Linda had moved to a new apartment across town and asked me to help her organize her kitchen, leading to a weekend of unpacking boxes and sharing stories about starting over. "You know what I like about our group," Linda said as we arranged dishes in her new cabinets. "Nobody tries to fix each other's problems. We just listen and share our own experiences and trust each other to figure out what works." That's different from how families sometimes operate. I said, thinking about my ongoing conversations with Sarah about money and independence and future planning. "Families have more invested in the outcome," Linda observed. "When my daughter gives me advice, she's not just trying to help me, she's trying to prevent herself from having to worry about me. It's not selfish exactly, but it's not purely altruistic either." The insight stayed with me as spring arrived and I settled into the rhythm of my new life. Sarah and I had found a comfortable balance, talking regularly, but without the undercurrent of tension that had characterized our conversations immediately after Robert's death. She'd stopped offering unsolicited financial advice, and I'd started including her in decisions that would affect our family relationships. When Emma asked if she could spend part of spring break with me, Sarah didn't hesitate to say yes, trusting that I could handle the responsibility of caring for an active 8-year-old for several days. "Grandma, can we plant flowers?" Emma asked on her second day of the visit, looking out my kitchen window at the small patio that came with my apartment. "You have a lot of pots, but they're all empty." "Those are left over from when I lived in the big house," I explained. "I haven't decided what to do with them yet." "We could plant things that butterflies like. My teacher says butterflies need places to stop and eat when they're flying around." Emma's enthusiasm was infectious, and before I could overthink the expense, we were at the garden centre selecting plants and potting soil and small tools sized for little hands, spending the afternoon planting marigolds and zinnias, while Emma provided a running commentary on everything from the texture of the soil to the proper way to water newly planted seedlings. I realised that this was exactly the kind of grandmother I wanted to be, present and engaged, but not overwhelmed by the responsibility of full-time caregiving. Emma went home to her parents at the end of the week with dirty fingernails and stories about our adventures, and I was left with a patio full of bright flowers and the satisfaction of having shared something meaningful without disrupting the careful balance of my daily routine. As summer approached, I began to think about the next phase of my journey. The library job was going well, my finances were stable, and my apartment felt truly like home rather than a temporary solution. But I was also aware that this stability was somewhat precarious, dependent on my health remaining good and my expenses remaining manageable. Jennifer Liu had suggested that I consider taking some classes in financial management or computer skills, both to increase my job security and to continue building my confidence in areas where I felt less certain. The community college offered a summer program in financial literacy specifically designed for older adults, meeting one evening a week for 6 weeks. The curriculum covered topics like investment basics, estate planning, and fraud prevention, all areas where I could use more knowledge. I signed up for the class and convinced Grace to enroll as well, turning what could have been an intimidating experience into an opportunity for friendship and mutual support. "I never thought I'd be going back to school at 58, Grace said as we walked across the campus on the first evening of class. "It feels strange and exciting at the same time. I keep thinking about all the things Robert handled that I never really understood," I admitted. "It's not that I couldn't have learned them, but it seemed easier to let him take care of the financial planning while I took care of everything else. And now I realize that easier isn't always better. Understanding how money works, how investments grow, how to protect myself from scams, these aren't just practical skills, they're independent skills." The class was taught by a retired bank manager named Mr. Peterson, who had the gift of explaining complex concepts in language that didn't require a business degree to understand. The other students ranged in age from their early 50s to their late 70s, and many were in situations similar to mine, newly widowed or divorced, trying to take control of finances they'd never managed independently. Over the 6 weeks of the program, I learned about compound interest and asset allocation, about the difference between stocks and bonds, about how to read financial statements and evaluate investment options. More importantly, I learned that I was capable of understanding these concepts and making informed decisions about my money. The knowledge didn't eliminate the challenges of living on a limited income, but it gave me confidence that I could navigate those challenges intelligently. "The most important thing to remember," Mr. Peterson said during our final class, "is that financial planning isn't about getting rich, it's about making choices that align with your values and priorities. Money is just a tool for creating the life you want to live." His words resonated with me as I thought about the choices I'd made over the past year. Moving to a smaller apartment hadn't made me wealthy, but it had given me independence. Taking the library job hadn't solved all my financial problems, but it had provided purpose and community. Learning to manage my money hadn't eliminated financial stress, but it had given me control over my own destiny. That summer also brought an unexpected opportunity. Carol Jensen from the Senior Centre called to ask if I'd be interested in helping to develop a new programme for recently widowed women, providing peer support and practical guidance for navigating the challenges of starting over later in life. The programme would involve facilitating support groups, organising educational workshops, and connecting women with community resources. We've had several women ask specifically for someone like you, Carol explained during our coffee meeting to discuss the proposal. Someone who's been through the experience recently enough to understand what they're facing, but who's far enough along in the process to offer hope and practical advice. What would my role be exactly? You'd co-facilitate a monthly support group with our staff social worker help planned quarterly workshops on topics like financial management and home maintenance, and serve as a mentor for women who are just beginning the journey you started a year ago. Carol handed me a folder with program outlines and resource lists. We're calling it the Second Chapter Program, and we think it could really make a difference for women who are feeling lost and overwhelmed. The offer felt like a natural extension of everything I'd learned and experienced over the past year. Would this be in addition to my library work, or instead of it? In addition to, if you're willing, we're thinking about 4 hours a month to start with the possibility of expanding if the program is successful. Carol smiled. Margaret, you've become exactly the kind of resource this community needs. Someone who understands that starting over doesn't mean starting from nothing. I accepted the position immediately excited about the prospect of using my experience to help other women navigate their own journeys toward independence and self-confidence. The first support group meeting was scheduled for September, giving me the rest of the summer to prepare and to reflect on what I'd learned that might be useful to share. As Labour Day approached, marking the first anniversary of my move to the apartment, I realised that I'd achieved something I hadn't thought possible a year earlier. I'd built a life that was entirely my own design, based on my own priorities and values, rather than on what other people thought I should want or need. The life wasn't perfect, money remained tight. Loneliness was sometimes a challenge, and uncertainty about the future was a constant companion. But it was authentically mine, and that authenticity had proven to be worth more than financial security or family approval. Sarah stopped by one evening in late August, bringing dinner from our favourite restaurant and a bottle of wine to celebrate her successful completion of a difficult real estate transaction. We sat on my patio among the flowers Emma and I had planted, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "Mum, I owe you an apology," she said as we finished our meal and settled back with our wine glasses. "When you first told me you wanted to stay independent, I thought you were being naive and stubborn. I thought I knew better than you did what you could handle. You were trying to protect me," I said. "I understand that. But I was also trying to control you, and that wasn't fair." Sarah looked around at the small patio, the tidy apartment visible through the sliding door, the life I'd created for myself. "You've proven that you know yourself better than I gave you credit for, and honestly you seem happier now than you did during the last few years with Dad." The observation surprised me partly because I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but also because I realised she was right. The last years of Robert's life had been dominated by his declining health and his increasing anxiety about money and the future. I'd spent so much energy trying to maintain our old patterns and routines that I hadn't noticed how constrained I'd felt, how little space there had been for growth or change or discovery. "I loved your father deeply," I said carefully. "But I think we'd fallen into roles that didn't leave much room for me to develop as an individual, not because he wanted to hold me back, but because our marriage worked well with him as the decision-maker and me as the supporter. And now I get to discover what I'm capable of when I'm responsible for my own choices. It's scary sometimes, but it's also exhilarating." I raised my wine glass in a mock toast. "Here's to second chapters and new discoveries. To mothers who are braver than their daughters give them credit for," Sarah replied, clinking her glass against mine. As autumn arrived and I began facilitating the second chapter support group, I found myself thinking often about that conversation with Sarah. The women who attended the monthly meetings were at various stages of their journeys toward independence, from those who had been widowed recently and were still struggling with the basics of daily life, to those who had been on their own for several years, but were looking for community and encouragement. What struck me most was how many of them had internalized the message that they were too old, too inexperienced, or too fragile to successfully start over. "I feel like I'm pretending to be a grown-up," said a woman named Joan during our October meeting. She was 62, recently widowed after 40 years of marriage, trying to figure out everything from how to balance a checkbook to how to get her car serviced without being taken advantage of. "Everyone assumes I should know how to do these things, but my husband always handled them." "That doesn't make you incompetent," I said gently. "It makes you someone who's learning new skills at a stage of life when most people think the learning should be finished, but there's no expiration date on growth." "Easy for you to say," Joan replied with a rueful smile. "You seem to have everything figured out." The comment made me laugh, which surprised the group. "Joan, I spent 3 months calling my daughter every time I had a problem with my smartphone. I've locked myself out of my bank account more times than I can count. Last month, I accidentally agreed to a service contract for my car that cost twice what it should have because I was too embarrassed to admit I didn't understand what the salesman was explaining." I looked around the circle of women, seeing recognition in their faces. The difference between where I was a year ago and where I am now isn't that I stopped making mistakes, it's that I stopped being afraid of making mistakes. "How do you do that?" asked another group member, a woman named Patricia, who had been divorced rather than widowed, but was facing many of the same challenges. "How do you stop being afraid?" You start small. You choose one thing that feels manageable and you figure out how to do it yourself. Then you choose another thing, and gradually you build confidence in your ability to handle whatever comes next. I thought about my own journey from learning to program the thermostat in my apartment to successfully negotiating the salary for my library position. You also give yourself permission to ask for help when you need it, but you ask for teaching rather than rescue. What's the difference? When you ask for rescue, you stay dependent on other people to solve your problems. When you ask for teaching, you learn to solve them yourself. I smiled at Patricia. "And you join groups like this one where you can practice being competent around people who understand what you're going through." As the meetings continued through the fall and winter, I watched women transform from fearful and uncertain to confident and capable. Not all at once and not without setbacks, but steadily and unmistakably. Joan learned to manage her finances and discovered she had a talent for budgeting and planning. Patricia took a part-time job at a local art gallery and started painting again for the first time in 20 years. A woman named Susan, who had never driven on the highway during 45 years of marriage, took a road trip to visit her sister in Colorado. Their stories reminded me that my own journey toward independence was part of a larger pattern, a process that many women experienced when circumstances forced them to discover capabilities they'd never been required to develop. The support group became as meaningful to me as it was to the participants, providing a sense of purpose and community that enriched my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. By the spring of my second year in the apartment, I had settled into a routine that felt both stable and flexible. The library job had evolved to include training responsibilities, teaching other staff members how to work effectively with older adults, and develop programming that met their needs. The Senior Centre had asked me to take on additional projects, including a technology mentorship program that paired tech-savvy volunteers with seniors who wanted to learn digital skills. The support group continued to meet monthly with new members joining as word spread about the program. Financially, I was doing better than Jennifer Liu's most optimistic projections. The combination of my salary, Social Security benefits, and careful budgeting had allowed me to build a small emergency fund and even contribute occasionally to my grandchildren's college accounts. More importantly, I had developed the knowledge and confidence to make informed financial decisions, adapting my budget as circumstances changed, and taking advantage of opportunities to increase my income when they arose. The relationship with Sarah had evolved into something more balanced and respectful. She still worried about me sometimes, but she'd learned to express her concerns without trying to control my choices. When I mentioned that I was considering buying a used car to replace my aging sedan, she offered to help me research options and negotiate with dealers rather than trying to talk me out of the purchase. When I told her about my plans to take a vacation with Grace to visit national parks in Utah, she asked about my itinerary and suggested places to stop rather than warning me about the dangers of traveling without a man. "You've changed, Mom," she said during one of our regular dinner dates. "You're more confident, more decisive. Even your posture is different." "How so?" "You stand up straighter. You make eye contact when you're talking to people. You speak up when you disagree with something, instead of just going along to avoid conflict." She smiled. "You seem more like yourself, if that makes sense." It did make sense, though. I wasn't sure I could have articulated it as clearly as Sarah had. The process of learning to live independently had required me to discover and trust my own judgment in ways I hadn't been required to do during my marriage. Not because Robert had been controlling or manipulative, but because our partnership had naturally evolved into a division of labor that left me responsible for some areas of our life and him responsible for others. When he died, I'd had to learn to manage his areas as well as my own, and in the process I'd discovered capabilities I'd never fully developed. As my second summer in the apartment approached, I began to think about longer-term goals and possibilities. The support group had generated interest in developing a broader program for older adults who were navigating major life transitions. Not just widows, but also retirees, empty nesters and people dealing with health challenges or family changes. The Senior Centre had received a grant to explore expanding their services, and Carol had asked me to help develop a proposal for a comprehensive life transitions program. "You have the perfect combination of personal experience and professional skills," she explained during our planning meeting. "You understand what people are going through, but you also know how to design and implement programming that actually helps." The opportunity excited me, but it also required a decision about how much responsibility I wanted to take on. The program would require more time and energy than my current part-time commitments, but it would also provide a chance to make a significant impact on the lives of people in my community. After discussing the possibilities with Jennifer Liu and making sure I understood the financial implications, I decided to propose reducing my hours at the library and increasing my involvement with the Senior Centre's programming. "Are you sure about this?" Mrs. Patterson asked when I explained my plans. "The library position offers more job security and better benefits." "It does," I agreed, "but the Senior Centre work offers more opportunities for growth and creativity, and at this stage of my life those things matter more to me than security." The decision felt risky, but right another step in the ongoing process of choosing growth over safety, possibility over predictability. I was learning that independence wasn't just about managing on my own, it was about taking responsibility for creating a life that reflected my own values and aspirations, rather than other people's expectations. The Life Transitions program launched in September, offering support groups, educational workshops, and individual counseling for older adults facing major changes. My role involved coordinating the programming, training volunteers, and facilitating some of the support groups. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, connecting me with people who were discovering, as I had, that major life disruptions could also be opportunities for growth and renewal. One afternoon, I was meeting with a man named Frank, who had recently retired after 30 years as an engineer and was struggling with the loss of structure and purpose that had defined his identity. He'd been referred to our program by his doctor, who was concerned about signs of depression and social isolation. "I don't understand what I'm supposed to do with myself," Frank said as we sat in my small office at the Senior Centre. For 3 decades, I got up every morning knowing exactly what needed to be done. Now I wake up and there's nothing but empty time. What did you enjoy about your work? I asked. What gave you satisfaction? Solving problems, taking something complex and figuring out how to make it work better. His voice became more animated as he talked about the projects he'd worked on, the challenges he'd overcome, the systems he'd designed and improved. I was good at it. People came to me when they had problems they couldn't solve on their own. Those skills don't disappear when you retire, I pointed out. The question is how to apply them in new contexts. Over the course of several meetings, Frank and I explored ways he could use his engineering background in volunteer work, community projects, and creative pursuits. He eventually became involved with a local organization that built wheelchair ramps for low-income residents using his technical skills to design solutions for complex installation challenges. 6 months later, he was leading a team of volunteer builders and had started teaching basic carpentry skills to teenagers in an after-school program. The funny thing is, I'm busier now than I was when I was working, he told me during a follow-up visit. But it's a different kind of busy. I'm choosing what to do with my time instead of having it chosen for me. Frank's transformation reminded me of my own experience. The discovery that ending one phase of life didn't have to mean accepting diminishment or irrelevance. It could mean finding new ways to contribute new sources of meaning and satisfaction, new aspects of identity that had been dormant during the years when primary roles and responsibilities dominated everything else. As the holiday season approached, marking nearly 2.5 years since Robert's death, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who had sat in Sarah's living room, feeling overwhelmed by financial projections and pressured to give up her independence, felt like a different person from the woman who now coordinated community programs and mentored other women through major life transitions. The external circumstances of my life weren't dramatically different from what Sarah had projected. I lived in a small apartment, managed a careful budget, and worked part-time to supplement my Social Security income. But the internal reality was completely transformed. Instead of feeling dependent and diminished, I felt capable and engaged. Instead of accepting other people's definitions of what was possible for a woman my age, I was creating my own definitions based on my own experience and aspirations. Christmas dinner that year was held at my apartment for the first time, with Sarah and her family joining me for a meal I planned and prepared myself. The space was too small for the elaborate entertaining I'd done in the past, but it was perfectly adequate for a simple dinner focused on conversation and connection rather than impressive presentation. "This feels more like home than the big house ever did," Emma said as she helped me set the table. At 9 years old, she had become my regular cooking and gardening assistant, spending part of most weekends with me, learning skills her busy parents didn't have time to teach. "Why do you think that is?" I asked, curious about her perspective. "Because you seem happy here. In the old house, you always seemed worried about something, whether the food was right, whether everything looked perfect, whether Grandpa was comfortable." She arranged the napkins with careful precision. "Here you just seem like yourself." The observation from a 9-year-old captured something profound about the changes I'd undergone. In the old house, I'd been focused on meeting other people's needs and expectations, managing Robert's comfort and Sarah's approval, and the social obligations that came with a certain lifestyle. In the apartment, I was free to focus on what actually mattered to me: relationships, creativity, service, growth. After dinner, as Sarah helped me clear the dishes and Tom played board games with the children, I found myself thinking about the conversation that had started this entire journey. Sarah's concern about my financial security hadn't been wrong, but her assumption that security required dependence had been incomplete. Real security, I'd learned, came not from having other people manage your life, but from developing the knowledge and confidence to manage it yourself. "Mum, I have something to tell you," Sarah said as we finished loading the dishwasher. "Tom and I have been talking, and we want you to know that we think you made the right choice. Moving in with us would have been the safe option, but it wouldn't have been the best option. What changed your mind? Watching you over the past 2 years, seeing how you've grown and what you've accomplished. She leaned against the kitchen counter, looking around at the apartment that had become so thoroughly mine. You're a different person than you were when Dad was alive. Not because you didn't love him, but because you never had the chance to discover who you were outside of being his wife and our mother. And now you're Margaret Walsh Program Coordinator and Mentor and Community Leader. You're someone who makes a difference in other people's lives because you figured out how to make a difference in your own life first. Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that acknowledged growth and change rather than just approval. I'm proud of you, Mum, and I'm grateful that you didn't let me talk you out of taking this path. The conversation continued as we finished cleaning up, touching on plans for the new year and dreams for the future. For the first time since Robert's death, I found myself thinking beyond just managing day to day, beyond just proving that I could survive on my own. I was beginning to envision possibilities I couldn't have imagined when survival felt like the only goal. As winter turned to spring in my third year of independent living, I received an unexpected phone call from Carol Jensen at the Senior Centre. A regional foundation was offering grants for innovative programs serving older adults, and she wanted to submit a proposal for expanding our life transitions work into a model that could be replicated in other communities. The grant would fund a 3-year pilot program with enough money to hire additional staff and develop comprehensive training materials. She explained during our meeting to discuss the opportunity. Margaret, I want you to be the program director. You've proven that this work can transform lives, and you have the credibility and expertise to lead its expansion. The offer represented a level of professional responsibility I'd never imagined for myself, but it also felt like a natural evolution of everything I'd been learning and doing over the past 3 years. What would that involve exactly? Full-time work for starters, benefits professional development opportunities, travel to conferences and training sessions. You'd be responsible for overseeing all aspects of the program, staff supervision, curriculum development, grant reporting, community partnerships. Carol handed me a folder with the grant guidelines and program specifications. It's a big job, Margaret, but I can't think of anyone better qualified to do it. I took the materials home that evening and spread them across my kitchen table, trying to imagine myself in the role Carol had described. The work excited me, but it also represented a significant departure from the careful, modest life I'd built over the past 3 years. Taking the position would mean higher income, but also higher stakes, more visibility, but also more pressure, greater opportunities, but also greater risks. Over the next week, I sought advice from the people whose judgment I'd learned to trust. Jennifer Liu helped me analyze the financial implications and career benefits. Grace and the other members of my walking group offered perspectives on work-life balance and professional growth at our stage of life. Sarah provided insights about the challenges and rewards of leadership positions, drawing on her own experience in real estate management. The question isn't whether you're qualified for the job, Sarah said during one of our conversations. The question is whether the job aligns with the life you want to create for yourself going forward. It was exactly the right way to frame the decision. Over the past 3 years, I'd learned to make choices based on my own values and aspirations, rather than on other people's expectations or society's assumptions about what women my age should want. The program director position offered an opportunity to continue that pattern of growth, to take on challenges that would stretch my capabilities while allowing me to make a meaningful contribution to my community. I accepted the position starting the new role in July with a combination of excitement and nervousness that reminded me of the first day of my library job 3 years earlier. The work proved to be everything Carol had promised: demanding but rewarding, complex but meaningful, challenging but aligned with my strengths and interests. By the end of my first year as program director, we had served over 200 people through our various support groups and workshops. The pilot program was generating interest from communities across the region, and I was invited to speak at conferences about innovative approaches to serving older adults in transition. The speaking engagements were perhaps the most surprising aspect of my new role. At 60, I found myself standing before audiences of social workers, program directors, and community leaders sharing insights about resilience and reinvention that had emerged from my own experience. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had once been afraid to disagree with a car salesman was now giving presentations about empowerment and self-advocacy to professional audiences. The key insight from our program, I told a conference audience in Phoenix, is that major life transitions aren't problems to be solved, but opportunities to be explored. When we approach someone who's recently widowed or divorced or retired with the assumption that they need to be fixed or managed, we miss the possibility that they might need to be empowered and supported instead. After my presentation, a woman approached me with a question that had become familiar. How do you help people overcome the fear of making mistakes? So many of our clients seem paralyzed by the possibility of choosing wrong. I tell them that the biggest mistake is not making any choices at all, I replied. Every decision teaches you something, even if it doesn't turn out the way you hoped. But indecision teaches you nothing except how to stay stuck. The conversation reminded me of my own journey from paralysis to action, from seeking permission to taking responsibility. 3.5 years after Robert's death, I had built a life that bore little resemblance to anything I could have imagined during those first months of grief and uncertainty. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't happened without setbacks and moments of doubt. But it had happened through a series of small choices to move forward rather than retreat to learn, rather than surrender to trust my own judgment, rather than defer to other people's fears. The success of the program also brought unexpected personal recognition. The regional foundation featured our work in their annual newsletter, and I was invited to serve on advisory committees for other organizations developing similar programs. The mayor's office asked me to join a task force on aging services, and the state university invited me to guest lecture in their gerontology program. "Mom, you're becoming famous," Jake teased during one of our cooking sessions. At 12, he had become my most reliable sous chef, helping me prepare meals for the support group potlucks and learning family recipes I'd never had time to teach him when I was managing a larger household. "Not famous," I corrected him, "just useful. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Famous people are celebrated for who they are. Useful people are valued for what they contribute." I handed him the measuring cups for the cornbread we were making. "I'd rather be useful than famous any day." "Can't you be both?" The question made me laugh. "I suppose you could, but it seems like it would be harder to stay focused on what really matters if you were worried about being famous." As my 4th year of independent living began, I found myself thinking less about proving that I could manage on my own, and more about how I wanted to use the time and energy I had remaining. The program director position had given me financial security I'd never expected to achieve on my own, but more importantly, it had given me a sense of purpose that extended beyond my personal needs and concerns. The support groups continued to be the heart of the work, providing space for people to share their stories and learn from each other's experiences. One Thursday evening in October, I was facilitating a session for recently divorced women when a participant named Linda raised a question that sparked an unexpectedly profound discussion. "How do you know when you're ready to start dating again?" Linda asked. She was 55, divorced after a 20-year marriage, and still struggling with questions about her identity and future. "I mean, I'm not even sure I know who I am without being married. How can I know if I'm ready to be with someone else?" "Maybe that's exactly why you should wait," suggested another group member, a woman named Carol, who had been divorced for 3 years. "Maybe you need to figure out who you are on your own before you try to figure out who you are with someone else." But what if I wait too long? What if I get so used to being alone that I can't adjust to being with someone? Linda's questions reflected fears I heard regularly from women who were rebuilding their lives after major losses. What if being alone for a while teaches you what you actually want in a relationship, instead of what you think you're supposed to want? I asked. What if taking time to know yourself makes you a better partner when you do decide to be with someone? The conversation continued for another hour, touching on questions about independence and companionship security and adventure past patterns and future possibilities. As I listened to the women share their thoughts and fears, I realized that I was grappling with some of the same questions in my own life. Since Robert's death, I'd been focused on building independence and establishing financial security. Romance had seemed like a distraction from those goals, and I'd assumed that dating was something for younger people or for women whose lives were less complicated than mine. But as my confidence grew and my situation stabilized, I found myself wondering whether I'd been limiting my possibilities unnecessarily. The question became more immediate a few weeks later when I was invited to coffee by David Chen, a retired physician who had started volunteering with our program after his wife died the previous year. David was 62, with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and he had a way of listening that made people feel heard and understood. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," he said as we sat in the cafe near the senior centre. "But I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me sometime, as more than colleagues, I mean." The invitation surprised me, not because David wasn't appealing, he was thoughtful and kind, and shared my interest in community service, but because I hadn't been thinking of myself as someone who dated. The identity felt foreign, like trying on clothes that belonged to a different person. "I'm flattered," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of relationship. I'm still figuring out who I am on my own." "I understand," David said, and his tone suggested that he genuinely did. "But maybe figuring out who you are doesn't have to be a solitary process. Maybe it can happen in the context of friendship and companionship." His words stayed with me as I drove home that evening, challenging assumptions I'd made about the relationship between independence and connection. I'd been thinking of them as mutually exclusive, as if choosing companionship meant giving up the autonomy I'd fought so hard to achieve. But David was suggesting a different possibility, that real independence might actually make healthier relationships possible, rather than preventing them. I talked through my confusion with Grace during our weekly walk, grateful for her ability to ask questions that helped me clarify my own thinking. "What are you afraid of?" she asked as we completed our second lap around the pond. "That you'll lose yourself again, that you'll become dependent on someone else's approval?" "Both of those things," I admitted, "and also that I don't know how to be in a relationship as the person I am now instead of the person I was when I was married to Robert. So don't try to figure it all out at once," Grace suggested. "Just spend time with David as a friend and see what happens. You don't have to decide whether you want to get married again before you know whether you enjoy his company." The advice was both simple and wise, reminding me that I could approach dating the same way I'd approached other challenges over the past 4 years, by taking small steps, gathering information, and making decisions based on actual experience rather than hypothetical fears. I called David the next day and accepted his invitation to dinner, suggesting a restaurant where we could talk without the formal pressure of a date. The evening was pleasant, but not overwhelming, filled with conversation about books and travel and the work we both found meaningful. David was easy to talk to, and he showed genuine interest in my experiences and opinions without trying to fix or advise or manage. "I enjoyed tonight," he said as he walked me to my car after dinner. "Would you like to do it again sometime?" "I think I would," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. Over the following months, David and I developed a friendship that gradually deepened into something more romantic, but never threatened the independence I'd worked so hard to establish. He had his own apartment, his own interests, his own circle of friends, and he respected my need for space and autonomy. More importantly, he seemed to appreciate the person I'd become, rather than trying to recreate the dynamics of a previous marriage. "You're different from other women I've dated," he told me one evening as we walked through the park where I'd been meeting my walking group for years. Different how? More self-contained, more confident in your own opinions, less interested in being taken care of. He smiled. It's refreshing, actually. I spent 40 years being married to someone who wanted me to make all the decisions. I like being with someone who makes her own decisions and then chooses to share them with me. The relationship evolved slowly and without pressure, adding richness to my life without dominating it. David and I went to movies and concerts, took weekend trips to nearby cities, and enjoyed quiet dinners where we talked about everything from current events to family memories. But we also maintained our separate lives and interests, coming together by choice rather than necessity. Sarah was initially skeptical about my relationship with David, worried that I might be vulnerable to someone who would take advantage of my financial stability or emotional independence. But after meeting him several times and observing how he interacted with our family, she relaxed into acceptance and even approval. "He seems to genuinely like who you are," she said after David joined us for a family barbecue. "He's not trying to change you or fix you or manage you." "That's because I don't need to be changed or fixed or managed," I replied, and he's smart enough to recognize that. The comment reflected a confidence in my own judgment that had been years in the making. The woman who had accepted Sarah's initial assessment of her financial limitations without question was gone, replaced by someone who sought advice but made her own decisions, who valued other people's input but trusted her own instincts. As my 5th year of independent living approached, I found myself thinking about the future with optimism rather than anxiety. The program I directed was thriving, serving hundreds of people annually and generating interest from communities across the region. My relationship with David was deepening into something that felt sustainable and nourishing. My finances were stable, my health was good, and my relationships with my children and grandchildren were stronger than they'd been in years. Emma, now 11, had become my regular companion for cultural events, accompanying me to art galleries and theatre performances, and developing sophisticated opinions about everything from poetry to photography. "Grandma," she said after we attended a museum exhibition about women artists, "do you think you would have been an artist if you'd been born in a different time?" "I don't know," I said honestly. I never thought of myself as particularly creative when I was younger, but now I think creativity isn't just about making art. It's about finding new ways to solve problems and express yourself and contribute to the world. Like what you do with the support groups. Exactly like that. I'm creating programs that didn't exist before, finding new ways to help people expressing ideas about what's possible for older adults. I smiled at her serious expression. Sometimes the most important art is the art of living well. Jake, at 13, had developed into my technological consultant, helping me navigate new software and digital platforms with the patience of someone who'd grown up with technology. "Grandma, you're better at this stuff than most people your age," he said as he helped me set up a video conferencing system for remote support group meetings. "That's because I had a good teacher," I replied, "and because I wasn't afraid to ask questions when I didn't understand something." "Is that your secret, just not being afraid to ask questions?" "Part of it. The other part is not being afraid to try things, even if you might not be good at them right away." I watched him adjust the camera angle with the easy confidence of a digital native. The worst thing that happens when you try something new is that you learn something you didn't know before. The wisdom I was sharing with my grandchildren had been hard-won through experience, through years of choosing growth over safety and possibility over predictability. But it had also become so natural to my way of thinking that I sometimes forgot how revolutionary it had seemed when I first started making those choices. The recognition came into sharp focus during a conversation with a new support group member, a woman named Helen, who was 73 and recently widowed after 50 years of marriage. She was struggling with tasks as basic as grocery shopping and banking, having spent decades leaving such responsibilities to her husband. "I feel like I'm 93 instead of 73, she said during her first group meeting. Everything seems impossible. I don't understand how people manage all these details on their own. One detail at a time, I said gently. And with the understanding that you don't have to figure everything out immediately. You have time to learn. But what if I'm too old to learn? What if my brain just can't handle new information anymore? Helen's questions reflected fears I remembered having myself, though they seemed almost foreign to me now. Helen, how old do you think I am? I asked. I don't know, 55, 60. I'm 61. When my husband died 5 years ago, I didn't know how to balance a checkbook or program a thermostat or navigate a computer. I was terrified of making financial decisions and convinced that I was too old to start over. I looked around the circle of women, seeing recognition in their faces. But I learned all those things, and I learned them in my late 50s and early 60s. Your brain doesn't stop working just because you turn 70. How did you do it? The same way you're going to do it, by asking for help when I needed it, by practicing until things became familiar, and by being patient with myself when I made mistakes. I smiled at her. And by remembering that learning something new at 73 is actually more impressive than learning it at 23, because you have to overcome more fear and assumptions to do it. The conversation reminded me of how much I'd changed, not just in terms of practical capabilities, but in terms of fundamental beliefs about what was possible. The woman who had sat in Sarah's living room 5 years earlier, overwhelmed by financial projections and convinced that independence was impossible, felt like a character from someone else's story. That woman had been replaced by someone who approached challenges with curiosity rather than fear, who saw obstacles as problems to be solved rather than evidence of personal inadequacy, who understood that growth and learning were lifelong processes rather than activities reserved for youth. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't happened without support from friends and family and professionals who believed in my capacity for change. But it had happened through my own choices and efforts, through my willingness to take risks and make mistakes and keep moving forward even when the path wasn't clear. As I prepared for my 62nd birthday that fall, I found myself thinking about the life I'd built and the future I was creating. The small apartment that had once felt like a compromise now felt like home. The budget that had once seemed restrictive now felt like a tool for making intentional choices. The independence that had once seemed frightening now felt like freedom. More importantly, I'd discovered that independence didn't mean isolation, that autonomy didn't require rejecting connection, and that starting over didn't mean starting from nothing. It meant building on the foundation of everything I'd learned and experienced while creating space for new growth and possibility. David had begun talking about the possibility of traveling together, perhaps taking a photography tour of Ireland or a culinary adventure in Italy. The ideas excited me not just because of the destinations, but because of what they represented: the confidence to plan for pleasure rather than just survival. The ability to envision a future filled with adventure rather than mere security. Sarah and I had developed a relationship that felt more like friendship between equals than the parent-child dynamic that had dominated our interactions after Robert's death. She still worried about me sometimes, but she'd learned to express her concerns as information rather than directives, trusting me to make good decisions with the facts she provided. "Mum, I'm proud of what you've built for yourself," she said during our birthday dinner. "But I'm even more proud of how you've helped other people build new lives for themselves. The work you're doing matters." "It matters to me too," I said. I never expected to find work that felt this meaningful at this stage of my life. "What's next? Are you going to keep doing this for the foreseeable future?" The question made me smile. 5 years earlier, I couldn't have imagined planning beyond the next month. Now I was thinking about 5-year goals and 10-year possibilities, about the legacy I wanted to leave and the contributions I still wanted to make. "I'm thinking about writing a book," I said, surprising myself by voicing the idea that had been forming in my mind for months. A practical guide for women who are starting over later in life, Not just about the financial aspects, but about the emotional and psychological challenges too. That's a wonderful idea, Mom. You have so much experience to share, and you have a way of explaining things that makes them seem possible instead of overwhelming. The encouragement meant more to me than Sarah probably realized. For decades, I'd thought of myself as someone who consumed other people's ideas rather than creating my own. The possibility of writing a book felt audacious and exciting, another step in the ongoing process of discovering what I was capable of when I gave myself permission to try. As winter settled over the city and I began my 6th year of independent living, I started working on the book in the early morning hours before heading to the office. The writing process forced me to reflect on everything I'd learned and experienced to identify patterns and principles that might be useful to other women facing similar challenges. The book became a way of honoring not just my own journey, but the journeys of all the women I'd worked with through the support groups and programs. Their stories of resilience and reinvention reminded me that my experience wasn't unique, that millions of women were navigating similar transitions and discoveries. The most important thing to understand, I wrote in one chapter, is that starting over doesn't mean starting from nothing. You bring everything you've learned, everything you've survived, everything you've accomplished to the new phase of your life. The challenge isn't to become someone completely different, it's to become more fully yourself. The words captured something essential about my own transformation. I hadn't become a different person after Robert's death. I'd become a more complete version of the person I'd always been, freed from the constraints of roles and expectations that had limited my growth for decades. As spring arrived and the flowers Emma and I had planted began to bloom again, I felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived and well chosen. The path hadn't been easy, and it hadn't always been clear, but it had been mine to walk, and that had made all the difference. Sometimes the most profound changes happen not through dramatic gestures, but through the accumulation of small, brave choices made day after day, year after year, until you wake up one morning and realize you've become exactly who you were meant to be. This is a dramatized story created for entertainment and inspiration, not medical, legal, or financial advice.